This week on Thought Rock Live, we have Wes Gorham presenting Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Management, Straightforward Approach. Wes is a senior business continuity and disaster recovery consultant with Integritas Solutions. He has more than 27 years of business and IT experience, including the delivery of complex BCDR solutions for clients across North America. Wes is also certified in ITIL version 3, I guess that's something else now, ITIL 2011 Foundations. Welcome, Wes, and I'll turn things over to you.
All right, thank you, John, and thank you, Wanda, and thank you for each of you for joining today as I present business continuity and disaster recovery management, a straightforward approach, and I hope you find the presentation enlightening and informative. Let's get started with a kind of an understanding of terms, business continuity and disaster recovery, depending on what segment of the industry that you come in or from, the nature of the business that you're in, or your background. These terms may be understood and interpreted a different way. Business continuity and disaster recovery are indeed two separate things, but one is part of the other. And when I do my planning for my clients, typically what I do when I set a business continuity program and initiate a program or a project to put a plan into place and to incorporate that within the organization, the enterprise itself, business continuity is an overarching umbrella of which many things such as crisis management and emergency response, disaster recovery, which is typically associated with IT operations and the services that the IT department provide. Now, that's just the way disaster recovery typically is coined in the industry, but it is really for the enterprise as a whole. Crisis communications, as I mentioned, emergency response planning, all part of disaster recovery, and the ability for an organization to respond to an interruption or an outage, whatever nature it is, whether it's catastrophic, there's physical damage to a facility, people, their health and welfare and their well-being is impacted possibly, or right down to a service disruption itself where IT systems or telecommunications, a building is rendered inaccessible, are all part of service disruptions typically. They're examples where disaster recovery is needed. But the definitions here, and Disaster Recovery Institute International has provided a very, very clear understanding here and very, very concise that what business continuity is. And I think it's very important that we understand what these two terms are and how they relate together. Business continuity is a process of developing advanced arrangements and procedures that enable an organization to respond to an event in such a manner that critical business functions continue without interruption or essential change. So very much a proactive implication involved with that. So pre-planned or pre-set standby arrangements in place so that an organization could be prepared if scenarios that they typically find that they're susceptible to, or likelihood, depending on the industry they're in, where their location is, or the type of business that they're in, they can make those arrangements all under the umbrella of business continuity. Disaster recovery is the actual processes or procedures, and it could involve actual capital as well, architectural, physical, it could be involved training, people response, to enable an organization to respond to a disaster and resume its critical business functions within a time frame. Now, perhaps many of you have heard the term recovery time objective, RTO, and recovery point objective. Now, these are two factors when we put disaster recovery plans in place to support the overarching business continuity program that come into play, and they're very, very key. We use those terms, but they're actually specifically defined early in the stages of putting a business continuity program together when we do what's called a business impact analysis. A risk assessment is also done. What threats are likely to impact our organization, if I can typically quote what a disaster recovery planner or a business continuity manager would be concerned with, and what are the critical business functions, or those business functions, what could be their maximum allowable outage where the organization can still sustain reasonable amount of profitability, reasonable amount of operation without impacting itself too much. Then from there, we actually set the recovery time objective for each one of those critical business functions, those critical business processes. And all of them have interdependencies to some degree on the infrastructure, people, facilities, process, technology, data in some cases. So those pre-advanced arrangements are all part of a disaster recovery solution. And when I put together a plan, typically what I do is I start with the disaster recovery aspects, and then I work myself up to the overarching processes at a higher level, or more procedures in common that the organization needs to know at a whole to support what those policies and guidelines and some audit requirements that are set by the organization. We'll look at that a little bit later. What are the drivers for a typical organization when we're considering putting in a business continuity DR program and investing, because it does to some degree cost money and it does impact on budgets? I categorize them in this. We want to look at it in this way. There's business requirements and then strategic dependencies that are set by the organization, typically set by the executives or the leadership of the organization. Let's look at that column on the right. Strategic dependencies, reliance on IT, 7x24 operations. And we think of typically in transaction-based processing, such as the financial banking industry, a lot of manufacturing, logistical type of businesses that run all over the world, global companies that require just-in-time delivery, and basically the IT systems never can go down. A big reliance on incident management, change management. We're talking about some of the practice disciplines, part of IT service management. I mentioned recovery time objective and recovery point objective, service agreements and obligations within the organization, and service agreements with vendors and with our clients as well. So we all have the supply chain where we're all playing together, and it's all so tightly knit. Then there's resiliency and rapid recoverability requirements. So these things are typically built into the requirements of an organization as to the type of business that they do and the requirements of being able to carry on operations. Then we go over to the business requirements as well, and then we see there are some industry standards that are drivers we need to consider as well. Sarbanes-Oxley, Basel II, those are two that are typical. The Patriot Act, which is also factored into many organizations. Resilience on the digital marketplace, keeping up with trends, emerging technologies that typically have a bearing on our business, audit and compliance requirements that seem to be getting tighter and more stricter all the time as new threats and new vulnerabilities for organizations are identified. Overall governance policy that the executives and leadership management actually set for the organization, and the need for quality control to keep costs down, keep cost containment, and still get a good return on investment. Then business vitality, they all work together. Sustain revenue growth to hit targets. Visibility of risk is one. I won't mention all of these. Consideration for fines or penalties. Sometimes an organization may be subject to fines or penalties depending on the degree of service delivery and whether targets are actually met or not. And all of these play a very key role. The business continuity and disaster recovery module, or that process, that program in the middle, helps to pull all those requirements together and maintain sustainability and profitability for the organization. So those are some of the drivers that typically fall into play.
Wes, we have a question actually.
Sure.
Someone's asking, what are the benefits from working with an organization's internal audit service when implementing or looking at these plans, and how sort of does that work in terms of ensuring governance and compliance?
Well, typically every organization that is, well run, well managed is has a governance policy, governance practices and standards. What has worked for me in the past is when I take a proactive approach in putting a program together, I know that there are implications in the overall vitality of the business itself. So I will actually contact internal governance, get those requirements, factor them into the program so that all of the processes and procedures in the business continuity plan itself and the disaster recovery plan can be matched back and can actually, for all those that are applicable, all those policies and guidelines stipulations are built into the plan and it's mentioned there. So that when an auditor comes and asks and audits the actual plan itself, and perhaps there's people here on the presentation today that have encountered this, that they can ask pretty deep questions and they can really scrutinize and look for anything that they can find where they can write up and make a comment. The idea is in business continuity planning is that proactive approach is to make sure that those incidents actually don't happen, that the plan itself actually sustains and upholds and supports those governance policies themselves. And it's worked positive for me. But the planner, the disaster recovery manager, business continuity manager needs to know what those specific things are, and it helps with the overall quality of the program itself and the visibility. If the audit is happy, audit compliance and governance is being looked after, then executives typically like CIOs of organizations, CFOs, and so on, chief operating officers are happy because they do see visibility on those audit comments, and that's worked positive for me. So kind of hopefully that sheds some light and provides some clarification on that.
Fantastic. Thanks for answering that question. I did forget to mention to everyone out there watching and listening, you do have a control panel, and if you want to participate in the conversation or post questions, just use the questions box and I'll monitor that. So that's how you can engage Wes in conversation. Thanks, Wes.
Okay, we looked at some of the drivers. Let's look at threats and vulnerabilities in our real world. Our organizations, and most organizations are subject to these, these considerations. I like to call them real-life hurdles. Weak contingency and business continuity. If there is no plan whatsoever, there is just no possible way that if there's a service disruption, that there could be a well-coordinated effort to return to some level of operation and to resume critical functions and to maintain profitability as well. There's going to be an adverse impact to that. Here's a typical one. Your supply chain is disrupted. Interruptions there. What to do? We still have customers on our downline. What happens if our vendors can't provide? And supply chain also affects our customers too. So if there's interruptions there, that's obviously a challenge. Security and privacy issues, I think that's pretty straightforward. Also premise security to facilities. There are a lot of, we're reading in the papers about a lot of crazy things that happen in regards to, physical security, premise security. Also keeping the right people that have a need to be in areas, especially sensitive areas where sensitive operations are taking place. We want to make sure that the security in a physical sense is maintained appropriately. Regulatory and also legal, fiduciary responsibilities and contracts. Those are often concerns. Confidence in the marketplace. Fraud, that's a very real issue in our world today. Terrorism has come on the scene in recent years, and a lot of organizations are putting into place very robust plans to deal with threats and thwarting threats of terrorism. Strikes as well. Some things that are a little more local and to home, we see that, but that can also create a service disruption and downtime and an outage to a certain extent, often affects supply chain related activities and operations. And then we look over on the right side of our slide and the potential impact. Yeah, there's real chance for revenue loss. Liability concerns. We're obligated under contract, and then, of course, legal liability as well, depending on where it is we do our business, what country, what state. Customer data that's been entrusted to us. or customer data that we may somehow have an impact to from the operations that we take care of from day to day. Loss of sensitive information is awesome too. Information either stolen or misplaced. So we want to keep tight reins on that, and that leads into kind of a backup and recovery strategy as well in IT, but not necessarily just limited to that. As we mentioned, liability issues above, bad publicity. If an organization that encounters an outage or an emergency of some kind, say there's a fire in the primary premise and in the office building, and that's not properly handled, well, you can be assured if there's smoke and fire that the press is going to be there in addition to the emergency services, and they're going to want a story. And you need a good, strong public relations manager and a public relations policy of what to say and when to say it and who says it. Bad publicity can be very, very damaging for an organization. So business continuity, preparedness for these service disruptions, you can begin to see how that's going to actually play out, where it's going to actually reduce risk. Penalties, investor confidence, impact to image as well. These are pretty straightforward, but these are some of the things that consider when you're doing your planning. It's worked well for me to, and also circle back to governance and audit and the executive levels of the corporation and explain to them some of the things that we were doing. And some of these have very, very tangible financial benefits as well, and reducing costs. For example, things like insurance costs. A good business continuity disaster recovery program is look favorable on the insurance company. Maybe it can help to reduce premiums. This is a very interesting slide, and this is what I call the business continuity resilience and disaster recovery continuum. It shows various stages or various levels, tiers within an organization, how an organization is organized. It's a very simple block diagram, but it shows the strategic interest of the organization from senior executive direction and commitment down into the lower level operations of the organization itself. And then, of course, operationally, that kind of information and cooperation is being fed back operationally back up to the executives. Well, this is a holistic framework. All aspects of strategic direction, of business strategy, goals, objectives of the organization, operational processes, activities, deliveries, services, products, relationships with vendors, relationships with customers, especially from a process end of it. It has to be holistic if there is going to be any kind of sustainability or profitability to be assured in a business continuity program. Okay, so a business continuity has to look at all these layers down to the very bottom and all the way back up. Operations is feeding information back up to the senior executives to be able to measure the performance of operations and the ability to be able to recover from a disaster or if there is business interruptions, and also the direction of instruction, guidelines, policies, and so on, down to the lower level so that programs, processes, procedures, and so on, the training of people, the preparedness can all be done in line with that. So it's all in line, it's all holistic. Let's, some of the things that senior executives do, as I say, they set policy in the direction, the vision. When we get down into the strategy, BCDR strategy layer, we're taking that vision that the executives are setting and we're creating a policy. This is what we want our business continuity and our recoverability program to do. We have a standard, and we set a strategy. What will that look like? What do we have to invest in? What do we have to buy and put into place? And how do we need to be prepared? What documentation is required? How do we need to train our people? How do we maintain that on an ongoing basis to make sure that things like attrition happen? How can we keep our employees and those that we work with from day to day prepared? Now, this is a very important bearing on customers as well. Customers look favorable on organizations or service providers that actually prepare for such things like this. It doesn't often come up, but it's a very, very good selling point that if we're negotiating an agreement with a client to say that we have a model in place that is proven, and we can prove through testing, we measure it, and we continuously improve it, and a quality bias and continuous improvement emphasis over time, where critical business functions that help deliver products and services to you, our customer, can be protected in case there are service disruptions. And we get down to the business process end of it. That's when we're actually building the actual meat of the plan itself, doing all the information gathering, data gathering, getting input from key stakeholders involving vendors and customers, and putting processes and procedures together. So the plan we can actually lay on the table, or we can see it on a web GUI, or keep it online in a SharePoint repository. We're building those plans. Once built, well, that's not enough. Then we have to maintain it, and we have to test it. And testing is exceptionally, I can't overemphasize the rigor that needs to go through for testing, especially in the IT, because there's a lot of complexities, a lot of technology involved there, and there's such a critical dependency on the IT department and the services that are being provided for overall service management. Testing those plans, the results of those test exercises are rolled back into continuous improvement. So it's a cyclical process. We build, we implement, we maintain, and then we test, and then we go back and forth all around in this cyclical motion, and it makes up the overall life cycle of the program. Business continuity DR integration. We integrate with the emergency response plan for the organization, and we also look for ways to improve preparedness, putting in established arrangements to ensure that business continuity is integrated with other key processes and programs and services being provided in the organization. So it's got tentacles that touch everything that is going on within the company. At the very, very lower level, we see some service management type functions with business impact analysis, where we define what our requirements are for continuity of key business functions. That process is in there. A delivery capability assessment. Now, when we're putting a plan together, we'll look at this a little bit different in the roadmap that I've plotted out. But you know, what is our capability to deliver process and preparedness for expectations that we have for services and products that we deliver to our customers? There's a method to do that, and I really encourage each of you to that are putting plans together involved in this type of work, to take an assessment of your delivery capability and look for areas where there might be gaps or deficiencies and plug them. Technical capability, the same applies to, but the technology that's been put into place, does it have the architecture and the resiliency that's needed in order to respond to either localized or widespread outages? A lot of organizations invest in some form of resiliency for hot site recovery for their technology, their IT investment. Also alternate work area recovery for people. If the main building is interrupted or rendered inaccessible, where do our people go? We see a lot of work from home arrangements, telecommuting type of arrangements that provides excellent contingency if facilities are affected. Service asset and configuration management, or asset management itself, change management, incident management, and the application processes as well to support systems, critical systems and applications are all part of that tier as well down at the lower level. And we talk about data storage, integration as well. Solution, it may be simple tape backup. We don't see that much. Most of it is disk to disk. We see SAN replication are some options that many organizations choose to protect the data itself and integrate that into pre-arranged or pre-standby arrangements to protect the IT investment. So this model here is a holistic approach, and it shows how senior executives at the director level, at the senior management level, and the lower operations of the company actually work together and maintain that sustainability and viability for the organization. Services model. typically, what is the services and the activities to build a business continuity DR solution, we can categorize in 4 main quadrants. The definition, up in the top left. Then there's a strategic or strategizing of the plan itself, where we put the strategy together. And then there's the implementation of that strategy. And then the activation of the strategy, where a lot of training and testing plans and refinement, and we go through the rigor of testing it and picking out deficiencies and results from that to look at better areas where we can, or better ways where we can actually improve the program overall and improve the processes that are used. So definitions, where a lot of what are requirements, and in the strategize quadrant, we're doing things such as the business impact analysis and both that delivery and technical capability, and selecting the solution that's going to best fit. And, there's a lot of challenges. We have to manage the probability and the factoring in of how much the business means to the level of investment it takes and the cost of putting in a strategy as well. So those things are considered when we strategize. So that typically is the 4-staged approach that I have used to keep a system life cycle for a business continuity DR services model in place.
Wes, we have a question.
Yeah.
What are the processes that can be used to ensure the maintenance and ongoing improvement of the business continuity and disaster recovery program? And are there idle processes that map to that, or what have you seen?
Well, I've created what has worked for me 4 main processes under the maintenance scope, and typically they're the 4. One of them is, the first one is the review and update DR plans. Periodic reviews can be over a monthly or a quarterly or semi-annually or an annually review, where the management of the company and those stakeholders in the business continuity program get together, and they're required to go over areas of the plan that they own and they're responsible to maintain. Pull all those findings together and then carry out through the change process of change control, change of documents. The things can be updated, training can be done, or further testing is required. That can be identified there. Managing the actual DR site. Now, if we have a primary facility for people, primary office or a primary data center, then there's the alternate data center, or whatever that alternate arrangement is. Maybe it'll be simply a cold site, a warm site, hot site. Those things need to be reviewed to ensure that they are keeping pace with the changing needs of the business. So there's a process there that I have typically used, and I encourage those who are doing their own planning to review those aspects of the plan and make sure that they're maintained as well. Then there's the testing of plans. Testing has a high degree of impact or potential to improve a DR plan, and also exercise. So when we exercise, typically we exercise in the test mode, but what about actually if we had to carry out an actual real live disaster, real live recovery? That is, that needs to process on its own, and so exercise, test, maintain, review and update, maintain plans, and also manage DR sites. Those are typical ones that I've used in the past, and they all are integrated with the change management policy. If changes and further refinements are needed, it goes through that control discipline. Hope that helps.
Excellent, thanks. Just a quick time check. Yeah, that's good. We're at 12:30, just so you know. And
okay.
I think we'll take
a few minutes on this one, and this illustration here basically takes the 4 quadrants, the work that's in the 4 quadrants in the slide we just saw previously, and it sets it out on stage of progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these stages all move progressive development from the start when we have a policy for business continuity and disaster recovery planning that's set by the executives, and we want to move that into something that's operational and that's a living, breathing program that's maintaining viability for the company. And stage 1, which is our requirements gathering and analysis stage, risk assessment, business impact assessment, where we know what is important to us and what steps can we do, what options do we have available to us to protect those. The delivery and technical capability assessments and a gap analysis are in that stage. We move on to the design and development stage, where the strategy, including program sustainability, that's key, solution options as well, what options are available to us based on what we know our threats, what we've assessed our threats and risks to be, and what we've assessed our potential losses are if we have a sustained outage. And then we get into stage 3, which is really planning and implementation. We'll take those options, we put them into action, create viable plans, processes, documentation, people, do the training, and then there's the testing and the evaluation as well. So as we test through a preset rigor of recovery, and this can even mean emergency response plans, building evacuation. What do people do if there is an emergency at a local site, not just the IT department and IT operations. And you can see there's an arrow that goes back from stage 4 back into stage 1. If we find something in validation that isn't quite right, we'll go back and say, hey, maybe we didn't collect the requirements just right, or we might have missed something. Hopefully it's just limited and they can go back through stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 and define those and blend those all into the program. Once done, validation is finished. Simple step in stage 5, known as deployment. Put it into action, and this is for future changes through the life cycle. They go down through the mill and go into the deployment cycle, and there's a service release or a release to active service activation that can take place in stage 5 and ensure that that is maintained. That's a smooth progression of a roadmap over a 5-staged approach. And of course, if we put the program together, what are some of the positive outcomes of the program? First of all, we're going to have a controlled project plan, and there's a risk assessment and a business impact analysis that is very, very key. I'll state with everyone, in my experience, a BIA is 75% of the work of a business continuity program. Not so much an effort, but the actual implications of it. A well-defined business impact analysis where there's time and energy and commitment from the executives right down to the lower operations, it's going to prove very viable and valuable as a BCDR solution is put into place. Alternate operating arrangements.
Wes, we have a question actually.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt, but a question just popped up. On your previous slide, you had the word commitment with respect to executives, and you just mentioned it again.
Yes.
So you talked about the role, but what I think the question is, what is the significance of their commitment?
Well, the significance of their commitment is they have the vision of what the organization is intending to do. They're actually driving the ship, and of all organizations need to be aligned with what is that strategic vision. Now, this is what is so communication from the executive level down through the organization can be actually facilitated and helped through a business continuity program, because it's continuity start to finish, right, end to end. So a holistic approach is definitely going to, it's going to benefit the overall emergency preparedness and to be able to sustain key functions and recoverability for an organization. It can't help it, but it's actually critical. Without the organization knowing what that strategic vision is in order to set the stipulations of the policy, then you can see how that is a big factor that's actually missing. And it's going to be disjointed, and it'll show out when, heaven forbid, a real interruption or service disruption should happen. The organization doesn't have an ability to coordinate recovery efforts correctly. Hope that provides some.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, it's a lot to do with sustainability and profitability, because interruptions cost. We want to limit the amount of investment. We also want to limit the amount of adverse business impact loss to the organization. But we got to know what those requirements are, and senior executives and directors of the company need to be plugged into the program. Where we left off, we talked about solution strategy and standby arrangements, emergency communication strategy, oh so key. We learned that in the upper East region of North America back in 2003. Many companies had very, very weak communication plan for emergencies, and it certainly showed. There was a massive disruption with that power outage. And many of you probably were either aware of it, depending on where you are, or you actually experienced and lived through it, as I did. So that is a key outcome of a business continuity program. Test, exercise strategy, and plan. Govern all testing, continuous improvement, and a training program too. Everybody knows what they need to know in the areas that they have stakeholdership in the plan itself, and that is one of the key outcomes. So the benefits of a well-managed business continuity and disaster recovery program: positive experience in difficult situations. We'd all like to have that. Comprehensive answer with a holistic view. That's what we're looking at, our Continuum model. And executives right down to lower operations. Protection of key, possibly all business functions. We talk about mission-critical business functions. Business continuity program focuses on all the functions, but particularly priority on those that are mission-critical. Minimize downtime and interruption. Reduce the risk of business termination. Some businesses actually cannot, depending on the significance of an interruption or a disaster, ever recover. The financial impact is so devastating. We see situations, devastating situations like 9/11. Some businesses that were affected by that tragedy never recovered at all, and some that are very, very crippled. Minimize financial impacts. There's effective plan to recover from disasters and service disruptions. Minimize loss. Enable the rapid recovery of business operation and avoid the ability to cope and manage with the unexpected. Improve that ability. And then asset protection is the last one. So that brings me to the end of my slide presentation. I'll entertain questions, further questions, John, if there's any.
Great. Yeah, great job. We do have a question from Jamie. For small and medium-sized businesses, is this financially viable, and do you recommend you have a shortcut or smaller plan to execute?
Well, when building a plan itself, how big should that plan be for a medium-sized business, if I understand the question? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the meat of the question is, yeah, is there sort of a light version for smaller, medium-sized businesses to execute? I'm guessing the question probably is about, this is fairly extensive and makes sense for large corporations. In a small, medium-sized business, how do you go about doing this and still be able to afford to do it?
Well, I would follow the same roadmap that I stated earlier, and all the same principles do apply, but maybe the level of detail that is required, for example, emergency communication plan, might be just quite light. There are only several names on there. But one thing I can say, an emergency communication plan, make sure you have your vendors and your customers in there as well, and it's being maintained and reviewed on a regular basis. Protection of the well-being of your employees and those that are on site, whether they be vendors, customers, or visitors. If they're on your site and you're responsible for them, if there's an emergency, those plans need to take into account them as well. So that can be relatively simple and relatively light. If a facility, maybe, if there's one office building or maybe it's distributed, that distributed people in different areas actually minimize the likelihood of localized emergencies or interruptions from affecting the business. But having work-at-home arrangements, you're not dealing with a large budget if you're dealing with small and medium-sized companies. So it has to be gauged. It's a balancing act between budget and what can be invested to what actual risks are associated with that organization. But yes, I've written plans that are relatively thin, that deal with specifically what is needed, what makes business sense, rationale. to do, and it comes up kind of with the creativity. It has to do with the creativity of the planner as well, and the experience, how well they know the organization. I can say this, that one of the positive outcomes has been for me is you really get to know how the organization end-to-end actually runs and what's truly important, how it actually operates. And that is something that nobody really has a full picture on when you really think of it, but a business continuity planner can really provide collect a lot of business intelligence within the organization and in the industry, and really help the organization along in this manner.
Very good, thanks. We have one more question. Have you seen or do you know of any software applications or tools that aid in this process?
There are some that are out there. I tend to use things more on the browser, HTML tools, Microsoft tools to use, but there are some out there. LDRPS is one. Stroll Data Systems offers. Rexus is also another product that's out there as well. They're more software. Some of them do have the flexibility to provide customization. Others do not and are very rigid. I tend to stay with the Microsoft products myself and use those tools. The key thing is it has to be stored, some reasonable ease of collecting information and storing it and managing change. But also it needs to be stored and easily retrievable by anybody in the organization that needs to see it. Okay, so there are products that are out there, but that is what I have found has worked well for me. So that answers the question. John?
Very good, thanks. Actually, you just got me thinking. There's probably some tie-ins to one of our other businesses where we do e-learning and decision support and stuff. There maybe are some tools in that arena that would help too. So
quite possible.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
That question got me thinking a bit.
All right.
If there aren't any other questions from the audience, then I'd like to thank you again, Wes. Great job. For those of you who are out there, remember 2 weeks from now we will have another Thought Rock Live session with Mark Latham talking about outsourcing. And the webinar that you attended today will be recorded for posterity. You'll get a link because you attended. So if you want to review any of this or share it with people on your team, maybe those executives that get their commitment, then please feel free to do so. Thank you very much for attending. And Wes, if I could just get you to go to the last slide. That will put up the contact information. There we go. And we'll just keep that slide up for a couple of minutes. Thanks very much, Wes, and thank you everyone for attending. Great job.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.